All right. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to move out of international immigration really quickly and into internal migration. This is still within your migration notes, but you may want to skip a couple pages. So this might be separate, even though people are pushed for similar reasons. Now, even though there are going to be similar pushes and pulls to international migration, there is a difference. And the difference is that internal migration, which means migration within the same country, is less disruptive. You're not stealing resources or putting them somewhere else or taking them and moving to a different country. It basically stays in the same area, and internal migration is much, much, much more common. In fact, when we raised our hands in class, most of you have committed internal migration. So why is it more common? Well, cultural friction is the answer, right? Like, it's much easier to move to a different city within the same state. You have the same taxes, you have the same blah, 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 you have the same friends, than it is to move to even to a different state or a different country where things are really different. It's also less expensive economically to move interregionally. You just hire a U-Haul, you have your friends put your stuff in, and you buy them pizza, right? There's less religious change. There's less economic vulnerability. It's the same jobs, the same area, the same environment. You get used to being in the cold. And if you go to where it's hot, you're going to think it's too hot. So internal migration is much, much more common for all that stuff. Now, the first version, and I hope I didn't get this wrong in class because even this knocks me around, is interregional migration. And interregional migration, inter means between and intra means within. Interregional migration is from one region to another in the same country. That'd be like if I moved from the south to the Midwest, or from the west to the Northeast. Like, it's the same country, but it's sort of regionally different. And it is usually, write this down, it is usually from the country to the city, usually from rural areas to urban centers, right? So if I'm going to move to a different region, I'm probably going to move to one of the bigger cities in that region. Makes sense, right? There's more economic opportunity. I got one of the touchscreens. More jobs, etc. So you should also notice on this map, look here, looky at America. You should know these things. Our interregional data has gone down, but the patterns are true. Most people, this is weird, but most people are moving to the south. The center of our population is shown at the top, is moving westward slightly, but it's actually moving southward more than it's moving anywhere else. I mean, this is since, like, what is that, like 1600 or 1800 on there when we started collecting data. We've moved west a lot, the center of our population, but more dramatically, we've moved south. So even though we don't think about the South a lot, or we don't think of it as like a culturally hierarchical place, it is the center of our population. Most people in America live in the South. Why? Well, more businesses open up as people move. The more people that move there, the more opportunity there is. The more opportunity there is, the more money there is, the da-da-da-da-da. And people are being pushed out of the Midwest for that exact reason. It was really important that we had steel for a while, and now steel doesn't really matter, and the car industry closed, so people left the Midwest for a lack of jobs. People are moving west, just not as much as they are moving south. For the same reason, tech jobs, etc. So interregional migration in the United States, you should definitely know that it is moving west, but is more than west moving south. Even though it looks like it's moving further west, you have to see how much distance there is to cover here. So the mean average is a little further. We're going to take a look at one of the worst things, and hopefully you get my U.S. history class next semester. One of the worst things that's pretty much ever happened is the Trail of Tears. And the Trail of Tears is going to be our example of what is a forced interregional migration. So the Trail of Tears, if you haven't heard or learned about it, it was Andrew Jackson signed a bill called the Indian Removal Act around 1835, 38. Oh, there it is right there, 1838. And that basically, well, there's so much to talk about, but you don't need to know it for geography. Essentially, a few people agreed to this, which meant that every single Native American, all of whom are different, even different religions and cultures, I mean, they just look similar, were all forced to leave the East Coast and go to like Wyoming, et cetera, the worst states. And we just kicked them out. We kicked every Native American out of the United States at the time. And that would be a great example of a forced political push, a forced interregional migration. It was a political push. They were literally forced at gunpoint to walk from all the way, some from Florida, some from, most from Georgia, South Carolina. They were forced to walk west and north through the snow. Thousands and thousands of Native Americans died. They were not allowed to stop except for at nighttime. It's really one of the worst things that's maybe ever happened in the world. And so it was a forced interregional migration. A different migration happened in about 80 years later, which is going to be, 1900? And we call this the Great Migration. And this was a voluntary interregional migration. The Great Migration was when lots and lots and lots and lots of Black people left the South. So they moved for opportunities. The South was still very racist, and it was really hard to get a job. They moved for social pushes or pulls because they had more freedom and more respect in the North. They also had economic pulls. There were more jobs and more opportunities. The pushes were, social racism. The KKK was popping around still. And this counts as a voluntary immigration, not when they were brought over to be slaves, but afterwards when they were freed, they left the South because frankly, the South sucked for them. So that is the Great Migration, is the voluntary interregional migration. Know this. It should be in your history books, but also you should just know this for your life. Now, we're going to take a look at some case studies of interregional migration. The first is China. Now, we're going to take a look at China, which is extreme urban to rural migration. Basically, what happened was everyone in China was trying to get to the coast. That's where all the jobs were, all the opportunity was. Things were so bad in Western and Northern China that people were leaving like crazy. And it was so bad that there's so many people tried to come that China restricted interregional migration laws. Like, for example, if you wanted to move to Oregon and the government said you absolutely under no circumstances can move to Oregon. And that happened in China, where people were forced to stay where they were at. In Russia, something very similar, very opposite happened. And Russia very famously is congregated over here on the left, right? Everyone's on the west side of Russia. This is where the opportunity is. But Russia realized that nobody was taking advantage of the vast resources of the eastern part of Russia. So Russia actually mandated that they forced workers to move eastward. It was a forced interregional migration on Russia's part. And you can still see the effects of that today. If you look at how people spread out in Russia, it is still mostly here. And then people were forced out there and they started new cultures. You should know both of those case studies for tomorrow's quiz, by the way. Ding, ding. You also need to know steppe migration. And essentially, steppe migration is migration from a destination that occurs in stages or steps. Essentially, the average person is going to, if they live in a farm, is going to then move to a village, and that village person is going to move to a city, and then the person from the city is going to move to like a huge city. It's pretty uncommon for someone from like podunk nowhere to move to New York City. Usually they're going to move to a medium-sized city first, then to maybe like a regional center. Well, Sacramento is a great example of a mid-sized regional center, then to maybe a large city like San Francisco. So it's really uncommon to have people go from the farms to the big cities, which is why we see it in movies so often when they get off the train and they're like, here I am in the big city. So cool. So far, everyone's good. Let's make it complicated. Hong Kong. So take a look at what we call intra-regional migration. Now, this is when you're in a region, but you move to a different part of the same region. Basically, you could move from a region to a different region, or you could move from different parts of the same region to another region of the same region. No, I just incepted myself. Basically, it's when you move from one part of a region to another. Like if I lived in Alabama in the South and I moved to Georgia in the South, that is intra-regional migration. Sacramento to Antelope, intra-regional. Roseville to Auburn, maybe slightly different, but it's more or less the same culture. I'm not going to have to change my lifestyle. I'm not going to have to do the most. And so why is intra-regional the most common movement? This is like Dora the Explorer. ¿Por qué? And you say, lower friction of distance and or cultural friction, and that's exactly right. Is basically when you stay within your region, it's much easier. Things are the similar. You don't have that friction of distance. Much more common than interregional, which is much more common than international. Cool beans. Cool. Now I'm going to jam through some things, some words you just need to know. We'll reflect on them later, but we probably won't bring them up for a little while, but you do need to know them. The first is, oh my gosh, my transition is so slow. Urbanization. We'll talk case studies later, but basically it's a type of intra-regional migration where everybody goes to urban centers. So we leave rural areas and we go to the urban center. Remember we talked about stage 2? This is stage 2. Everyone moves to the cities. Rural to urban. Boom, boom, boom. And then within urban areas, people will often, well, that's boring. People will often move within urban areas to other urban areas. So once you're in that rural, once you urbanize, people just move from urban to urban areas. Easy enough. Suburbanization happens around stage 3 or 4. People are feeling more comfortable. They're safer with their money. They can then exit the urban centers and move out to suburbia. This is called suburbanization. And this is when people move away from the city into more houses and stuff like that. That is where we are right now in Roseville. We are in the suburbs, which is kind of adjacent to a city, not really its own city, but kind of close. Those are the suburbs. And all of that, and this is what's really important about suburbanization, and you need to know this, is notice this landscape. This has changed forever now because of the spread of people away from a city. This all used to be, I don't know, trees and grass and farms, and because of suburbanization, we call it the concrete jungle or the concrete expanse, and that really changes the way the world works. So then people move from cities to suburbs. Now we're in a weird spot. People with money tend to move from cities, not to the suburbs, but to rural areas. And this is called counter-urbanization. I want you to think about like hipsters, like, oh, I just need to get away from society, man, and move to Vail, Colorado, where I can surf on the snow all the time. This is people with money and technology. This only happens when people can afford to live a rural lifestyle. That was Astrid and her phone going off. Where people can afford that like fake poor lifestyle. They move away from the cities, and only if you have a job you can do via the internet, or only if you have a job you can do from a distance can you do that. And only people with money can generally pull this off. It's called counter-urbanization. It's a luxury. And then finally, this is where Sacramento is, we have what's called re-urbanization, where everyone who left the city now sees that the city is cool, and this is going to get into cultural stuff, but man, I wish I could live in the city where all this cool culture is going on, and they come back to the urban areas, and that's called re-urbanization. All those people who went to live in the woods are like regretting like they've got FOMO, and they miss the city. It got dingy, but now we put a bunch of money into it, and we've got the Doco Center or whatever it's called, and we're all going to go back to the inner cities. Success? So be sure you've got all that on lock for tomorrow. But I believe you can do it. Hopefully you can see my face.